even getting into like the new music exposure, like that was like quite different from like conservatory training. Like, you know, you're taught like the major concertos and like you're supposed to like practice your scales in Bach and like, you know, diligently learn your Paganini caprices. Like you're kind of like taught that there's like this levels to gaining technique and like building your repertoire. And I had never known that new music like could be a part of that. And
so it's not like this thing that's completely separate to you. It's like all kind of the same. This is kind of the situation I find myself in as a composer.
Yeah.
You know, because it's like, well, how do I convince through my writing that this is part of the whole thing? This is not like the separate thing.
Right.
And so for you kind of figured that out for yourself, but it was more of a personal thing. It wasn't like a teacher that told you, hey, you should play this new music thing. And it's good for you. It's like another course of vegetables or something.
I wish really? I had. Yeah, okay. I really wish I had a teacher or a mentor who would really like inspire me to look for a repertoire that, you know, would be different but would push me in like new ways. I learned a lot just by seeing what my friends were doing and what other people were doing. And I thought it was kind of interesting because it wasn't like the path that I had like been told to walk upon, you know. It was like kind of something different. It's kind of something unknown. And it was just like you find something you like, and it's not like there's a history of like this concerto is the best concerto, right? Like it's kind of like what you like is what you like, and like what you hear is like you can have your own personal take on it. And I think for me that was like a really something that really freed me as a violinist particularly, but also just as a musician. Like you said, like working with composers kind of helped me find a little bit of more of that humanity to writing. Like it's not just like these notes were written down by God and like
that's what it seems like.
I mean, that's kind of what we're taught, you know, like, oh, these, like, this is how you're supposed to play this passage. And like, you know, like you listen to the great violinists and like, you know, emulate what they do. And of course there's value to that, right? Like there's value in terms of growing, you know, in the traditional way as well. But I just thought like this was just a really interesting way of seeing somebody else work and compose and see that process and saying like, hey, like that process of working through a piece has always been really fascinating to me, because it's like sort of sometimes by trial and error, you know, like you don't really know until you hear what it sounds like. And then even then, like the player might have certain things that like feel good or don't feel good, and that there's like a feedback loop. And so I've always been really interested in seeing that process like change, and seeing like how composers will like change stuff, revise stuff. And in a lot of ways that's changed what I've thought about traditional music as well. Like now when I go back and I see that like Brahms totally rewrote like his B major trio or whatever, like that gives me different insight into him, even though I can't like text him or call him or ask like, hey, why'd you change that? Like that was really good in the first version.
If he was alive today, he would be getting a lot of texts. Probably wouldn't have a phone. He'd probably be in a cave like this one, actually, now I think about it.
Yeah. I always just thought like, you know, composers, they finish it and then like, ta-da, like, and you know, there's a process of that too, of course. And depends on the composer and everybody's like own personal process. But just having that, like being able to see that from a personal end, like really changed how I view music just in general, and be able to like connect those things to the things that the pieces that I was taught too.
I mean, the idea of the feedback loop is really interesting, because I've had many musicians come to me saying, oh, you know, like, you know, we want to commission a piece from you, yada, yada, yada. You know, this is the date that we expected to have it. And I would usually tell them, you know, you're going to have a lot of stuff before that, and I expect to have some feedback from you.
Yeah.
So sometimes that works well, sometimes it doesn't, depending on who the musicians are.
Right.
So I like also as a composer to have that feedback from musicians. Like I am humble enough to know that I don't know everything about every instrument.
Right.
And the other thing is, when a lot of composers, I feel like they finish the piece and then it's done.
Yeah.
And that's it.
Yeah.
And I feel like there's like a lot of room in that process of when you don't know, because like composers don't like to admit they don't know something, and I do it all the time.
Yeah.
I mean, not to say that, I'm doing it the right way. I don't know what the right way is, but the more that I say I don't know how an instrument works, I feel like the better it's going to be for me in the long run, because I'll add more technique to my, toolbox.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important for a composer just in general, because I'm noticing more and more, and I have a lot of students, that take lessons with me and so on, that they write mostly in the computer program, and there's not much interaction with the musician, even if it's one musician.
Right.
And it sounds kind of like basic, from our vantage point, that of course you have to collaborate with the composer or musician.
Yeah.
But it's something that I don't think that is as obvious, I think.
Yeah.
So to hear you say that, you like to have that feedback loop with a composer.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's what every composer wants to hear.
Yeah, because there's technique that's possible, and then there's technique that is idiomatic to the instrument, right? And things that we've been sometimes trained to do, and other things that just feel natural on the instrument. And I think there's a difference between possibility and what will ultimately help the performer bring the piece to its best light, because that's not possible without, I guess unless it's electronic music, it's not, or computerized music. You need the performer to feel good about it, right? And feel like they have something to say, and feel like this is something that they can put their own voice into too. And I feel sometimes that that part is a little bit lost, that part of it. And I really value when composers are how does that fit for you? What are the things that you think really sound good, or the things that would help bring this piece, because it's a collaboration, I think, ultimately. Yeah. You think of a lot about people who had those kinds of, going back to Brahms, who was the violinist's name? Now I'm forgetting, of course.
I don't remember either.
There's a violinist who was very famous for working with him on all of his stuff. So they sent drafts back and forth, And Andrew, I know, is somebody who's a constant reviser, always revising stuff. Yeah, so sometimes I'll just get random texts from my composer friends, hey, is this how would this sound? Does that feel okay on your instrument? And I'm always happy to see that process, because I think it's really valuable,
Yeah, I've been texting back and forth, speaking of that, with I think you know her, Michelle Sang from.
Oh yeah.
She's in the LA Phil, so I've been writing
Michelle.
her some text back and forth of just sketches of violin stuff. I said, what do you think of this? Will this work? So it could work, but if you don't want the LA Phil to play your pieces again, then I wouldn't put that in. I'm like, oh, okay. No, but she was right. For other reasons, I took that part of the piece out. But I like when people are honest too, because then it gives me a chance to say, okay, you know what, I'm going to do it anyway, and I accept the risk.
For sure.
Of if it doesn't go well.
Yeah.
And then if they tell me, oh, that's easy, then sometimes I think, well, that was too easy. Maybe I should have, maybe there's something else I could do.
Yeah.
That's more of an extreme of this version that maybe will help propel the piece.
Right.
Maybe there's something I was not thinking of.
Yeah.
So to me, it's super, and even if it's a instrument like the violin, which I feel like I know better than, I don't know, trombone or tuba or, any of these or even percussion. I feel like I know the violin better than most other instruments. It's still, I'm going to ask every time I write something new for violin, what can I do? Right. So.
Yeah. And I think of course, ultimately, it's the composer who has the pen, right?
Yeah, of course.
But it's about getting that information and getting that, feedback from the performers. And I think that relationship only strengthens the composition,